There are moments in history when the weight of the world becomes so unbearable, when the old order has grown so corrupt and the human spirit so suffocated beneath the heel of dogma and empire, that something extraordinary emerges from the silence. Not a revolution carried on the blade of a sword, not a reformation hammered to a church door. Something older than both, something quieter, stranger, and infinitely more patient, arose placed at the centre of a cross, a symbol so ancient in its bones that no single hand drew it, and no single voice gave it name. This is the story of the Rosicrucian Order, and it does not begin where most histories begin. It does not begin in the printing houses of Germany in the early 17th century, though that is where the world finally heard its name spoken aloud. It does not begin with a young theologian writing allegories in a Tübingen university town, though his pen would eventually unleash a fury of reaction that swept across an entire continent. It begins, as all great rivers begin, far upstream, in a country of shadows. In the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, in the Hermetic laboratories of Alexandria, in the Sufi lodges of Fez, and in the silent, tortured hearts of those who refused to believe that the divine could be owned by any institution, any bishop, or any king. To understand what the Rosicrucians were, one must understand what they were up against. By the dawn of the 17th century, Europe had been hemorrhaging for nearly 100 years. The Protestant Reformation, launched by Martin Luther in 1517, had split Christendom open like a wound that would not close. What followed was not enlightenment, but catastrophe. Catholics and Protestants slaughtered one another with a religious conviction that would have horrified the Christ they both claimed to follow. The 30 Years' War, which erupted in 1618, would ultimately kill between 8 and 12 million people, soldiers, peasants, women, children, whole cities erased from the map of existence, entire communities reduced to famine and plague. Europe was not reforming. Europe was consuming itself. Into this environment of absolute spiritual crisis, 3 anonymous documents arrived as if from the sky. And the first was the Fama Fraternitatis Rosae Crucis, the fame of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, circulated in manuscript form around 1610 and published in Kassel, Germany in 1614. The second was the Confessio Fraternitatis, published in Frankfurt in 1615. The third, published in Strasbourg in 1616, was the most extraordinary of all, the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. 3 texts, 3 anonymous documents, and they detonated across the intellectual landscape of Europe like nothing that had come before. Between 1614 and 1620, approximately 400 manuscripts and books were published in response to these manifestos. Scholars, physicians, alchemists, theologians, princes and common men wrote letters, pamphlets, arguments and counter-arguments across the length and breadth of the continent, each attempting to contact this mysterious brotherhood that had announced itself and then, seemingly, vanished into thin air. The peak of what historians would come to call the Rosicrucian furor arrived in 1622, when 2 extraordinary posters appeared on the walls of Paris within days of one another. The first read, "We, the deputies of the Higher College of the Rose-Croix, do make our stay, visibly and invisibly, are in this city." The second ended with words that have haunted scholars ever since. The thoughts attached to the real desire of the seeker will lead us to him and him to us. Visibly and invisibly. No address, no name, no face. Only the challenge. Find us if you are worthy. Who were they? Where had they come from? What did they want? To answer those questions honestly, one must move backward through centuries and across continents, ungathering the threads of a tradition so ancient and so deliberately concealed that it appears, to the uninitiated eye, as nothing more than a collection of unrelated legends, symbols, and religious currents. But to those who have studied these waters with patience and without prejudice, a pattern emerges. One pattern, hiding beneath the surface of every major spiritual movement the Western world has ever known. The story the farmer tells begins with a man named Christian Rosenkreuz. Born, as the text suggests, in the year 1378, the last surviving son of a noble German family in the Thuringian forest, a family that had embraced the Albigensian or Cathar doctrines, that extraordinary and fiercely persecuted tradition of Gnostic Christianity that had been nearly exterminated by the Albigensian Crusade a century and a half before. The rest of his family had been put to death. The child, 5 years old and alone in the world, this was carried away secretly by a monk, an Albigensian adept from Languedoc, and placed in a monastery already under the quiet influence of the Cathar survivors, where he was educated alongside 4 brothers who would eventually join him in the founding of a new fraternity. It is important to pause here and hold this lineage in the mind. Christian Rosenkreuz, even in the legendary account, is not described as a man who invented something new. He is described as the survivor of a destroyed tradition, a living ember carried out of the ruins of a fire. The Cathars, who believed the material world to be a creation not of the highest God, but of a lesser, corrupt demiurge, who rejected the authority of the Roman Church entirely, who claimed that salvation lay not in sacraments dispensed by bishops, but in the direct personal experience of divine light. These were the people who had raised Christian Rosenkreuz. Before he was anything else, he was the last inheritor of a line of illuminated heretics. From the monastery, young Rosenkreuz set out on a pilgrimage that would become the allegorical backbone of the entire Rosicrucian tradition. He travelled to Cyprus. He travelled to Damascus. He found his way, according to some versions of the legend, to the mysterious city of Damcar, thought by some scholars to be located in the Arabian Peninsula, or in what is now Yemen, where he was initiated into what the texts call the Magnus Opus, the great work of the alchemists. He studied physics and mathematics. He translated the mysterious Book M, a volume of concentrated cosmic knowledge that the Brotherhood would later declare one of their most sacred possessions, second only to the Bible. From Damcar he travelled to Egypt, and then onward to Fez in Morocco, a city that was, in his time, one of the great intellectual centres of the known world. And Fez was home to the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded in 859 CE, and recognised by historians as the oldest continuously operating university on Earth. In Fez, Rosenkreuz encountered Turkish, Arab, and Persian sages, scholars of Islamic mysticism, students of Sufi wisdom, men who stood at the crossroads of traditions descending from Zoroaster, from Plato, from the ancient Egyptian priests who had transmitted their knowledge through Arabic translations and Sufi interpretations across the centuries. Manly P. Hall, whose encyclopedic work on secret teachings remains one of the most thorough Western surveys ever compiled, wrote that in Fez, Rosenkreuz was introduced to the elemental beings and began gaining a deeper understanding of nature and the universe. He became an adept in the gathering of medicinal herbs, the principles of transmutation, and the understanding of the stars and their influences. He mastered the sciences that in his Europe would have been called magic, but in Fez were simply called knowledge. It is here that the Rosicrucian legend reveals something most people entirely overlook. Christian Rosenkreuz did not travel to these Islamic centers of learning as a Christian missionary. He traveled as a student. He sat at the feet of Arab and Persian masters and absorbed what they had to teach him. And what they had to teach him was not foreign to the tradition he had inherited from his Cathar adoptive father. It was, in the deepest sense, the same tradition arriving from a different direction. The Sufi mystics of Fez and the Cathar Christians of Languedoc and the Hermetic philosophers of Alexandria had all drunk, at different times and in different vessels, from the same underground river. This is what the Rosicrucian legend is ultimately about. They're not a single order with a founding date and a membership roll, but a recognition that beneath the surface of every genuine spiritual tradition, beneath the legalism of institutional religion, beneath the political ambitions of church and state, beneath the competing claims of prophet and priest, there exists a single ancient current of wisdom that has never been fully extinguished. This is what Michael Meyer, one of the great intellectual champions of Rosicrucianism in the 17th century, captured in his 1617 work Silentium Post Clamores, when he wrote that the roots of the order reach back to the Egyptian and Brahminic civilizations, intertwining with the mysteries of Eleusis and Samothrace, drawing from the Persian Magi, the intellectual pursuits of the Pythagoreans, and the enlightened thought of the Arabs. Rosenkreutz, enriched with wisdom beyond anything Europe had yet conceived, he returned to Germany, gathered around. around him a small group of brothers, 8 men in total, and established the Domus Sancti Spiritus, the house of the Holy Spirit. This house, the legend says, he enveloped in clouds, meaning he concealed it behind layers of symbol and allegory, so that it could not be found by those who were not already ready to find it. The brothers made a set of laws. They would heal the sick freely without payment. They would maintain no particular uniform or outward sign of their membership. They would meet once a year to share their findings. They would each find a replacement before their death to carry the work forward. And they would keep the existence of the Brotherhood concealed for 100 years. When Rosenkreutz died, at the legendary age of 106, his brothers buried him in a 7-sided vault beneath the house of the Holy Spirit. The vault was lit by an artificial sun. Its walls were inscribed with symbols and allegorical images that contained the compressed knowledge of all that the Brotherhood had gathered. At its centre, beneath an altar, lay the preserved body of the Father, incorruptible, unchanged by time. 120 years after his death, the vault was discovered by the brothers of a new generation who had not known it existed. They found his body exactly as described. They found the Book M. They found the Compendium of Knowledge, and they interpreted the discovery as a signal. The time for concealment was over. The time for the general reformation of the world had arrived. Whatever the literal truth of this legend, its symbolic content is precise and intentional. The 7-sided vault is the septenary, 7, the number of the classical planets, the 7 days of creation, the 7 seals of revelation, the 7 stages of alchemical transmutation. Each side inscribed with 10 symbols, 70 in total, drawing on the Kabbalistic tradition of the 70 divine names, the 70 nations of the world, the 72 sacred letters of the Shem HaMephorash. The Book M. Scholars have long debated what this book represents. Some say it stands for Mundus, world. Some say Magia. Some say it is simply the Book of Life, the record of nature's own laws written not in human language, but in the language of correspondences, the language that the Rosicrucians believed linked the macrocosm to the microcosm, the stars to the body, the metals to the soul. The Fema does not end with the discovery of the tomb as a historical curiosity. It ends as a manifesto. It calls upon the learned of Europe, not the powerful, not the wealthy, not the institutionally religious, but the genuinely learned to announce themselves, to make contact with the Brotherhood, to participate in what it calls a general reformation of the whole wide world. The Confessio, published the following year, elaborated the stakes of this invitation. The Pope was declared the Antichrist. The wealth and corruption of the institutional church were condemned. A new science, built on the esoteric truths of the ancient past, was promised to those who were ready to receive it. Not the mechanical science of weights and measures that would dominate the following century, but a sacred science, one in which nature was understood as alive, as intelligent, as suffused with correspondence and meaning, as a living body of divine expression rather than a machine to be taken apart and quantified. But who wrote the manifestos? This question has occupied historians for 4 centuries, and the honest answer remains: we do not know with certainty, though we know a great deal. Yet the most plausible candidates are the members of an intellectual circle in Tübingen, Germany, centered around the figure of Johann Valentin Andreae. Born in 1586, Andrea was a German Lutheran theologian of extraordinary learning, a man whose acknowledged writings display the same range of themes found in the manifestos: utopian social reform, the fusion of science and spirituality, the critique of institutional corruption, the dream of a universal renovation of human civilization. Was he later admitted to being the author of The Chemical Wedding, though he described it in his autobiography as a ludibrium, a jest, a playful intellectual exercise, a statement that scholars of esotericism have interpreted in contradictory ways for centuries. Some take it at face value. Others argue that Andrea, who spent his career as a respectable clergyman, could not afford to claim ownership of documents that had been condemned by religious and political authorities, and that his dismissal of the manifestos as a joke was simply the most sophisticated form of protection available to him. Tobias Hess, a Paracelsian physician and member of Andrea's circle, and Christoph Besold, a lawyer and polymath of formidable intellectual range, are now believed by many scholars to have collaborated in the composition of the Fama and Confessio. The broader Tübingen circle drew on the same wellspring: the Paracelsian tradition of natural philosophy, the Kabbalistic learning that had poured into Christian Europe since the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, the Hermetic texts that Marsilio Ficino had translated for Cosimo de' Medici in Florence a century and a half earlier, and the Protestant millenarianism that believed the end of the world as it was currently organized was not only imminent but necessary. The intellectual soil in which these men planted their manifestos had been prepared over a very long time. Yet to understand how deep the roots truly go, one must return to ancient Egypt, not as myth, but as documented reality. In the temples of Egypt, for thousands of years before the Christian era, there existed what the Greeks called mystery schools, select, initiatory institutions where qualified students were led through carefully graduated stages of spiritual training. Not theology in the institutional sense, not the rote memorization of doctrine or the performance of prescribed ritual for the benefit of divine administrators. Something more demanding than that, something more dangerous. The Egyptian mysteries aimed at direct experience. The initiates of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, the priests of Osiris at Abydos, the keepers of the sacred science in the temples of Heliopolis. These were men and women who understood that the cosmos was alive, that the human being was a microcosm of the universe, and that the purpose of a human life was not mere survival or social reproduction, but the conscious return of the divine spark within to its source. When the Greeks encountered this tradition, when Pythagoras travelled to Egypt and spent 22 years in the temple schools, when Thales and Solon and later Plato sat at the feet of Egyptian priests and returned to Greece bearing something they could barely translate into their own language, they recognized something. They recognized a wisdom older than themselves, more systematic and more profound than anything they had yet achieved, and they carried it home and built upon it. This is the transmission line, from the Egyptian temples to the Greek philosophers, from the Greek philosophers to the Neoplatonists of Alexandria, from Alexandria, that extraordinary city where Egyptian priests, Jewish mystics, Greek philosophers, and early Christians sat side by side in the same libraries and argued the same questions about the nature of God, the structure of the cosmos, and the salvation of the human soul. From Alexandria, the tradition flowed in multiple directions simultaneously. It flowed into the Hermetic literature, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Asclepius, and the Poimandres, those beautiful and strange texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, the Greek name given to the Egyptian god Thoth, thus master of wisdom, writing, and the secret arts. It flowed into the Jewish Kabbalah, that system of mystical cosmology built on the Hebrew alphabet and the structure of divine emanation, which would eventually arrive in Christian Europe and electrify an entire generation of Renaissance thinkers. It flowed into the Arabic world, where scholars during the golden age of Islamic civilization translated and preserved and extended the Greek philosophical inheritance, and where alchemical traditions descended ultimately from Alexandria were transmitted through figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan, Geber in the Latin West, who synthesized Hermetic principles into a comprehensive science of transformation that would profoundly shape European alchemy for centuries. Then it went underground. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Europe entered what later centuries would condescendingly call the Dark Ages, the access to the full depth of the ancient tradition was largely cut off for literate Europeans. The mystical inheritance survived in monasteries where monks copied texts they often only half understood, in the fragmentary references of church fathers like Lactantius and Clement of Alexandria, who'd read the Hermetic texts and found in them an anticipation of Christian wisdom, and in the traditions of Arab scholars whose translations would eventually return to Europe through the reconquest of Spain and the Crusades. During this centuries-long silence, the tradition did not disappear. It disguised itself. It encoded its teachings in the love songs of the troubadour, those wandering poets of Languedoc whose hymns to a distant, unreachable lady were, in the judgment of many scholars of esotericism, not love poetry at all, but initiatic allegory describing the soul's love for and separation from the divine. It concealed itself in the alchemical formulas of Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon, men of extraordinary learning who understood that what they were really studying was not the transmutation of lead into gold, but the transformation of the human soul. It survived in the Kabbalistic manuscripts circulating in Jewish communities from Babylonia to Spain to southern France, and in the handful of Christian intellectuals who gained access to those manuscripts and recognized in them something that had no name in their own tradition. The situation transformed decisively in the 15th century, and the transformation began in Florence. When the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Greek Orthodox scholars fled westward, carrying with them manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and the Hermetic texts that had been largely unavailable in the Latin West for over 1,000 years. The great Cosimo de' Medici, patriarch of the most powerful banking family in Europe, created in Florence the conditions for one of the most remarkable intellectual explosions in human history. He established the Platonic Academy, gathered around him the finest minds of Italy, and in 1463 gave the scholar and philosopher Marsilio Ficino a commission that would change the course of Western civilization, translate the complete works of Hermes Trismegistus before beginning on Plato, because Cosimo believed, as the entire Renaissance world would come to believe, that Hermes Trismegistus was older than Moses, older than Abraham, a primordial Egyptian sage who had received divine revelation in the most ancient era of human history. The Hermetic texts were considered not the work of second-century Alexandrian writers synthesizing Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion, as modern scholars now understand them to be, but as authentic transmissions from the dawn of time. Ficino completed the translation of what he called the Poemander in spring of 1463. Cosimo, old and dying, had it read to him on his deathbed. Within 8 years the first printed edition appeared, and within 25 years there were more than 24 printed editions circulating throughout Europe. The Hermetic texts became, arguably, the most widely read documents of the Renaissance. It was in the context of this Hermetic Renaissance that the figures who would eventually inspire the Rosicrucian Manifestos were formed. Pico della Mirandola, born the same year Ficino completed his Hermes translation, mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic before his mid-20s, and became the first Christian scholar to systematically incorporate Kabbalah into Christian theological argument. His 900 theses, drawn from every philosophical and religious tradition he could find, Aristotle, Plato, the Neoplatonists, Zoroaster, the Chaldean oracles, Hermes Trismegistus, the Arabic commentators, and 72 theses from the Kabbalah, were intended as the foundation of a universal philosophy, demonstrating that all wisdom traditions, however different in their surface expressions, pointed toward the same ultimate truth. His oration on the dignity of man, written for the disputation he was never allowed to hold after Pope Innocent VIII, condemned several of his theses as heretical, while he declared that the human being occupied a unique place in the cosmos not because of fixed essence or predetermined nature, but because of the radical freedom to become anything, to descend toward the bestial or to ascend toward the divine. This was a Hermetic idea. It was also a Kabbalistic idea, and it would become, a century and a half later, one of the foundational ideas of Rosicrucianism. Then there was Paracelsus, Philippus Aureolus, Theophrastus, Bombastus von Hohenheim. Dem, born in 1493 in Switzerland, is one of the most consequential and misunderstood figures in the history of Western thought. He revolutionized medicine by rejecting the ancient Greek humoral theory that had dominated European medical practice for over 1,000 years, and replacing it with a system of natural philosophy grounded in direct observation, alchemical analysis, and what he called the correspondence between the macrocosm, the universe, and the microcosm, the human body. Paracelsus believed that every disease had a specific cause and a specific remedy, that metals and minerals could be used as medicines when properly prepared, and that the physician who did not understand the stars and the elements and the spiritual constitution of the human being was not a physician at all, but a butcher. He was furious, erratic, frequently drunk, contemptuous of authority in every form, and possessed of a genuine revolutionary genius. His alchemical philosophy was hermetic to its core. The as above, so below principle that the universe and the human being were structured according to the same laws and composed of the same fundamental substances. The Fama Fraternitatis explicitly praises Paracelsus and claims that the Brotherhood possessed a book resembling his works. Heinrich Kunrath, the German Hermetic philosopher whose 1609 Amphitheatrum Sapientiae Aeternae directly influenced the first Rosicrucian Manifesto, and was himself a follower of the Paracelsian tradition, and John Dee, the English mathematician, astrologer and occult philosopher who served Queen Elizabeth I, and whose Monus Hieroglyphica of 1564 provided the philosophical key that opens the chemical wedding, was deeply engaged with the same Hermetic and Paracelsian synthesis that would flower in the Rosicrucian texts. There is also the matter of Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and statesman who in his New Atlantis described a utopian society called Solomon's House, a community of scholars and scientists dedicated to the systematic study of nature and the improvement of human life, a description so strikingly parallel to the stated goals of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood that scholars have argued about the relationship between Bacon and the Manifestos for 4 centuries. Bacon's Advancement of Learning, published in 1605, are called for a comprehensive reform of human knowledge along empirical lines. His Instauratio Magna, the Great Renewal, proposed nothing less than the complete rebuilding of human civilization on a scientific foundation. These are not obviously Hermetic goals, but the thematic resonances with the Rosicrucian call for a general reformation of the world are undeniable. And many historians regard both the Manifestos and Bacon's utopian writings as expressions of the same underlying impulse: the belief that humanity stood at the threshold of a new age, and that the accumulated wisdom of the ancient past, properly understood and applied, could heal the catastrophe of the present. The chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, the third and most literary of the 3 Manifestos, deserves extended attention because it is in many ways the most revealing. They are published in Strasbourg in 1616, attributed in its author's own later writing to Johann Valentin Andrea. It tells the story of Christian Rosenkreuz receiving an invitation, delivered by an angel with golden wings, to attend a royal wedding at a mysterious castle. The journey occupies 7 days, structured as the 7 days of creation in Genesis. On each day, Rosenkreuz undergoes trials, witnesses marvels, encounters symbolic figures, and is transformed. He attends a weighing of souls, he watches the execution of false kings, participates in the resurrection of a dead royal couple through alchemical processes, and is finally knighted on the 7th day. The title is deliberately alchemical. Chemical, the old form of chemical, refers in alchemical tradition to the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, the union of opposites, of king and queen, of sun and moon, of sulphur and mercury, of male and female principles, which was understood to be the ultimate goal of the great work. This is the same union that the Kabbalah describes as the reunion of the Shekinah, the feminine divine presence, with the masculine Ein Sof. It is the same union that the Sufi mystics described in the language of love poetry. It is the same union that the Neoplatonists described as the return of the soul to the One. Different vocabularies, different symbols, the same mystery. The chemical wedding is structured as a rite of passage, an initiation narrative in the most classical sense. Descent, Rosenkreuz does not ascend through the 7 days as a passive observer. He is tested, found wanting in some respects, catches himself in the act of voyeurism and vanity, faces death symbolically, and emerges on the other side as something different from what he was when he began. This is the initiatic pattern as old as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, as old as the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, where the initiate descended symbolically into the underworld and returned transformed. If the pattern is the same because the insight is the same, that genuine spiritual transformation is not a gift, is not a doctrine one can be taught, is not a membership one can purchase, it is a death and a rebirth. The lead must die before the gold can emerge. The old self, rigid, frightened, attached to comfort and convention, must be given up before the new self can be born. This is what the Rosicrucian tradition called the Great Work. Not the literal manufacture of gold from base metals, and though the alchemical language was precise and intentional, the furnace is the soul, the lead is the uninitiated self, the gold is the illuminated consciousness that the ancient mystery schools of Egypt and Greece and India had always described as the true goal of human existence. What made the Manifestos so electrifying was not merely that they claimed a secret brotherhood existed. What made them incendiary was what they said that Brotherhood knew and what it intended to do. The Fama declared that the Brotherhood's philosophy was the same as the philosophy of Adam, of Moses, and of Solomon. This was not a modest claim. This was a claim to possession of the primordial wisdom, the original knowledge of the relationship between God, humanity, and nature that had existed before the fall, before the dispersal at Babel, before the corruption of the ancient mystery schools by institutional religion and political power. The Confessio went further, and declaring that the Pope was the Antichrist, that God had already sent signs of the coming transformation, citing specific new stars that had appeared in the constellations Ophiuchus and Cygnus, and that a comprehensive reformation of religion, politics, and knowledge was not merely desired, but cosmically ordained. These were not safe statements in an age when the Inquisition still operated, when people were still burned for heresy, when the power of Rome and the power of the Protestant princes were both prepared to crush anything that threatened their authority. The response was accordingly divided. Some of Europe's most distinguished scholars and physicians became passionate advocates for the Brotherhood. Michael Meyer, a German physician who had served as Count Palatine in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, devoted much of his intellectual life to interpreting and defending the Rosicrucian philosophy. His Atalanta Fugiens of 1617, a collection of 50 alchemical emblems accompanied by musical fugues and explanatory epigrams, is one of the most extraordinary productions of the Baroque era, a synthesis of visual art, music, and Hermetic philosophy that presents the alchemical process as simultaneously a cosmological, psychological, and spiritual journey. Robert Fludd, the English physician and occult philosopher born in 1574, he published a vigorous public defense of the Rosicrucian cause. Fludd was an astrologer, mathematician, cosmologist, Kabbalist, and Paracelsian physician of formidable learning. He published a vigorous public defense of the Brotherhood in 1616, arguing that its philosophy was neither heretical nor diabolical, but represented the culmination of the Hermetic tradition that had been present in Western thought since Ficino's translations of Hermes Trismegistus. Fludd's own cosmic philosophy, which conceived of the universe as a vast musical instrument vibrating with divine harmonies, with the human body as a microcosm containing within it every principle of the macrocosm, was itself an expression of the Rosicrucian vision. Thomas Vaughan, Elias Ashmole, Julius Sperber, Gabriel Naudet. The list of those who engaged seriously and enthusiastically with the Rosicrucian challenge is long and distinguished. The opponents were equally fierce. Andreas Libavius, one of the founders of what we would now call scientific chemistry, attacked the manifestos as fraudulent, dangerous, and diabolical. He demanded that the Brotherhood reveal itself and submit to examination by proper authorities. Gabriel Naudet, the French librarian and skeptic, wrote a scathing analysis arguing that the Rosicrucians were either a pure invention or a dangerous cabal. The Jesuit order, which correctly perceived in the Rosicrucian philosophy an existential threat to its own model of organized spiritual authority, was especially hostile. The first person definitively known to have received a copy of the Farmer before its publication was Adam Hasselmayr, a Paracelsian musician and theorist who wrote an enthusiastic response to it, and was promptly seized by the Jesuits and condemned to labour on a galley. This was not a debate conducted only in pamphlets and letters. The stakes were real. The consequences were violent. Then came the 30 Years' War. It began in 1618, the year after The Chemical Wedding was published, with the defenestration of Prague, the literally unprecedented act of Protestant nobles throwing Catholic imperial representatives out of a castle window in Bohemia. The war that followed was catastrophic beyond any European precedent. The Habsburg Catholic imperial forces swept through Protestant lands. The brief Bohemian kingdom of Frederick and Elizabeth, the so-called Winter King and Winter Queen, whose court had been a centre of Hermetic and Rosicrucian thought, collapsed in 1620, just a few years after it had been established as a beacon of the kind of enlightened Protestant monarchy the Manifestos had seemed to envision. In 1618, a pamphlet by Henricius Nohusius stated plainly that the Rosicrucians had departed for the East due to European instability caused by the war. Then whether or not any literal brotherhood had ever existed, the intellectual and cultural moment in which the manifestos had appeared was shattered by the conflict. Rosicrucianism was associated with the losing side of a religious war. It went underground. But it did not disappear. It never disappeared. What happened instead is what always happens with wisdom traditions that cannot survive in the open. They encoded themselves in symbols, embedded themselves in institutions, and waited. The most significant institutional carrier of the Rosicrucian inheritance was Freemasonry. The transition from operative to speculative masonry, from the lodges of actual stone masons who built the cathedrals of Europe to the philosophical fraternity of gentlemen initiates, occurred between the late 16th and early 18th centuries, precisely the period during which the Rosicrucian movement was at its height. Historian David Stevenson has argued that Rosicrucianism was directly influential to Freemasonry, as it was developing in Scotland in the early 17th century. Manly P. Hall, in his monumental Secret Teachings of All Ages, stated more strongly that several initiated Rosicrucians were brought from the European continent to England, Dist, where they designed the symbolism of Freemasonry and incorporated into its rituals the same divine principles that had formed the inner doctrine of all great secret societies from the time of the Eleusinian Mysteries. When the Grand Lodge of England was formally established in 1717, the outer structure of a new fraternal organisation was publicly unveiled. But many who have studied the inner symbolic content of the Masonic degrees have recognised in them, in the allegory of Hiram Abiff, the master builder murdered by those who wanted his secrets, in the lost word that the initiates seek to recover, in the architecture of Solomon's temple as a symbol of the cosmic order, the same Hermetic and Rosicrucian ideas that had been circulating in Europe since the publication of the Manifestos and indeed since the translation of the Corpus Hermeticum in Florence in the 1460s. The Golden Rosenkreutz, the Golden and Rosy Cross, was founded in Prague in the early 18th century by the alchemist Samuel Richter, who published under the pseudonym Sincerus Renatus. It was a formal hierarchical secret society with internal circles, recognition signs, and alchemical treatises, and it explicitly claimed that its leaders had invented Freemasonry and that only they possessed the true interpretation of the Masonic symbols. Under the leadership of Hermann Fichtel, the organization was extensively reformed in 1767, and again in 1777, and at the convent of Wilhelmsbad in 1782, it achieved remarkable influence over several prominent European Masonic lodges, leading many Freemasons to become Rosicrucians. The Golden and Rosy Cross even penetrated the Prussian court, with its members Johann Christoph von Wöllner and General Johann Rudolf von Bischofwerder, influencing the policies of the Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm II in ways that had direct consequences for the political history of Germany. Two Rosicrucian-inspired Masonic rites emerged toward the end of the 18th century: the rectified Scottish Rite, widespread in Central Europe, and the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite first practiced in France, in which the 18th degree is called the Knight of the Rose Cross. This last detail is not incidental. To rise to the 18th degree in the Scottish Rite, to pass through the levels of entered apprentice, fellow craft, master mason, and then through the higher philosophical degrees, was to arrive eventually at an explicitly Rosicrucian initiatory stage. The Rose Cross was not a metaphor in these rites, it was a destination. It would be an error to imagine that only the famous figures of esotericism engaged with this tradition. Some of the most consequential scientists and philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries were deeply influenced by Rosicrucian and Hermetic ideas. Isaac Newton, who is remembered as the father of modern physics and calculus, spent at least as much of his intellectual energy on alchemy and Hermeticism as on what we now call science, and his private notebooks, which were not fully made public until the 20th century, reveal a man obsessed with the transmutation of metals, the secrets of the philosopher's stone, and the hidden meaning of biblical prophecy. Newton was a member of the Royal Society, the organisation that grew out of what Robert Boyle called the Invisible College, that network of natural philosophers and experimenters who'd been meeting informally since the 1640s to share knowledge acquired by experimental investigation. The concept of the Invisible College itself appears in German Rosicrucian pamphlets of the early 17th century, and many historians have seen in the founding of the Royal Society the transformation of the Rosicrucian dream into a more empirically disciplined institutional form. René Descartes, the philosopher and mathematician who established the foundations of modern rationalism, travelled extensively through Germany in the years after the publication of the Manifestos, specifically searching for the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. He reportedly never found them, or if he did, he was not speaking about it. Wilhelm Leibniz, the co-inventor of calculus and one of the great universal philosophers of the Baroque era, was deeply engaged with the Rosicrucian tradition. Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the United States and the man who brought scientific discipline to the study of electricity, is included among those who had contact with Rosicrucian teachings, as is Thomas Jefferson. The list of intellectually and politically consequential figures who engaged seriously with these ideas, who took the Hermetic correspondence between inner and outer, between macrocosm and microcosm, between material and spiritual transformation, as a genuine description of reality rather than superstition, is not a list of fools or dreamers. It is a list of the individuals who shaped the modern world. The 19th century brought a new wave of organized Rosicrucianism, and with it the same fundamental questions about institutional authority, legitimate succession, and the relationship between outer form and inner content that had plagued the tradition since the days of the Manifestos. The Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia was founded in England in 1865, drawing its membership exclusively from Master Masons, and taking as its explicit purpose the study of Rosicrucian philosophy in its historical and symbolic dimensions. Its founding members were also deeply engaged with what they called the Hermetic tradition, and the organization served as the immediate institutional precursor to the group that would become, in the last decades of the 19th century, the most influential synthesis of Western esoteric traditions since the Renaissance. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Founded in London in 1887, the Golden Dawn drew on the Kabbalah, astrology, alchemy, ceremonial magic, tarot, Enochian magic, the elaborate angelic system developed by John Dee in the 16th century, and the full range of Rosicrucian symbolism that had accumulated over the preceding 3 centuries. Among its members were William Butler Yeats, who had become the greatest English-language poet of the 20th century, and who found in the Golden Dawn a vocabulary for his mystical and nationalist vision. Arthur Machen, the Welsh novelist whose supernatural fiction drew directly on his Golden Dawn training, and the controversial and brilliant Aleister Crowley, who joined and was eventually expelled. The grade structure of the Golden Dawn was directly descended from the 7-sided vault of Christian Rosenkreutz's tomb, those 10 symbols on each of the 7 walls that the Fama Fraternitatis had described but never explained, and which the Golden Dawn finally elaborated into a complete system of initiatory symbolism. Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian occultist and philosopher who founded Anthroposophy, gave a series of lectures on the theosophy of the Rosicrucians in 1907 that remain among the most serious intellectual engagements with the tradition ever produced. Steiner took the question of Rosicrucian succession seriously, in a way that few of his contemporaries did. He insisted that the alchemical language of the Manifestos was symbolic, that when the Rosicrucians spoke of transforming base metals into gold, they meant the transformation of base human vices into the gold of human virtue, but that this symbolic interpretation did not make the teaching trivial. On the contrary, he argued, it made it more demanding. The transformation it described was not the relatively simple matter of manufacturing a substance in a laboratory. It was the comprehensive reshaping of the entire human organism, its thinking, feeling, and willing, in alignment with the living spiritual reality of the cosmos. Nicholas Goodrick Clarke, one of the foremost scholars of Western esotericism, described Steiner as having blended modern theosophy with a Gnostic form of Christianity, Rosicrucianism, and German natural philosophy into a system of remarkable coherence and scope. Steiner's influence extended far beyond esotericism. Waldorf education, which he founded, now operates more than 1,000 schools worldwide. Biodynamic agriculture, which he developed from Rosicrucian and Hermetic principles about the relationship between cosmic forces and living organisms, is practiced on farms across every continent. The ancient mystical order Rosicrucis, a MORC, was founded in New York in 1915 by Harvey Spencer Lewis, who claimed to have received the teachings from European Rosicrucians. Whatever the precise legitimacy of this claim, Lewis built the organization into the largest Rosicrucian institution in history, with a headquarters eventually established in San Jose, California, complete with an Egyptian museum that became one of the most highly regarded collections of its kind in the United States. AMEORC's approach is non-dogmatic and non-denominational. Its members are encouraged to explore questions of consciousness, cosmic law, and spiritual transformation through a curriculum of monographs covering 12 degrees, spanning metaphysics, mysticism, alchemy, and the natural sciences. At the heart of the AMORC teaching is the concept it calls cosmic attunement, the direct experiential realization of one's unity with the divine and the cosmos. It is stripped of institutional trappings, the same realization that the Egyptian mystery school sought, that the Pythagoreans described, that the Hermetic texts called Gnosis, that the Kabbalists called Devakut, that the Sufi mystics called Fana, that Paracelsus called the light of nature, and that the Fama Fraternitates called the General Reformation of the world. The vocabulary changes. The pointer remains the same, to encounter the symbolism of the rose and the cross seriously, to sit with it rather than simply accumulate facts about it, is to recognize that these two images have been present at the center of every major Western spiritual tradition, long before any organization called itself Rosicrucian. The cross is the oldest symbol of intersection in human thought, the meeting of the vertical and horizontal, of heaven and earth, of the eternal and the temporal, of the divine descending and the human ascending. It appears in Egyptian hieroglyphics as the Ankh, the cross of life, thousands of years before it was adopted by Christianity. It appears in the Kabbalistic tree of life as the crossing pathways between the divine attributes, the Sephiroth, through which divine energy descends and human consciousness ascends. It appears in the Hermetic doctrine of the four elements arranged in their cross of fire, water, earth, and air, through which all material reality is structured. The rose is the flower of Venus, of divine love, of the unfolding of the soul in beauty. In the Christian mystical tradition, the rose is the symbol of the Virgin Mary, of the soul's opening toward God, of the mystical heart. In the alchemical tradition, the red rose is associated with the philosopher's stone in its final, perfected state, the red tincture that transforms base metal into gold and base humanity into spiritual gold. In the Sufi tradition, the rose is the emblem of the divine beloved, toward whom the nightingale of the soul eternally sings in longing. And in the symbol of the rose cross, the rose placed precisely at the center of the cross, at the intersection of heaven and earth, then, of the divine and the human, the two traditions are united. The meeting point is love. The crossing point of all dimensions is the heart. This is ultimately what the Rosicrucian tradition has always claimed to know and to guard, not a set of secret technical procedures, not a hidden method for the manufacture of gold, and not a political agenda disguised in allegorical language, though it has been all of these things at different times and in different hands, but a recognition of the heart as the site of transformation. The Fama Fraternitatis ends with a call to the learned of Europe to make contact with a brotherhood that is prepared to share everything it knows, freely, with those who are genuinely ready. The brotherhood asks nothing in return except sincerity, except readiness, except the willingness to be changed by what one finds. This is the oldest initiatic condition there is. The Eleusinian mysteries of Greece required it. The Egyptian temples required it. The Sufi lodges of Fez required it. The Rosicrucian circle in Tübingen required it. Not wealth, not birth, not institutional credential, Only the condition of genuine seeking, genuine readiness, and genuine willingness to undergo the transformation that real knowledge, not information, not doctrine, but gnosis, and direct knowledge, always requires. It is a condition that cuts across every religious boundary, because it does not belong to any one religion. It is the condition recognized at the heart of Christianity in the letters of Paul, who declared that he preached a mystery wisdom to those who were mature, a wisdom not of this age nor of the rulers of this age. It is recognized in the Jewish tradition in the Talmudic warning that the innermost teachings of Kabbalah were to be transmitted only one-on-one from master to student in a relationship of direct knowing. It is recognized in Islam in the tradition of the Sufi masters, who distinguished between the exoteric religion, the Sharia, the law that governs the outer life of the community, and the esoteric reality, the Hakika, the truth that only the purified heart can perceive directly. It is recognized in Hinduism in the distinction between the Upasana, the outer forms of worship, and the Paravidya, the higher wisdom transmitted directly between teacher and student. It is the universal distinction, found in every tradition without exception, between religion as institutional management of the masses and wisdom as the individual's direct encounter with reality. The Rosicrucian Order, whatever its precise historical origins and institutional forms, has always claimed to stand on the side of wisdom rather than religion in this deeper sense. The claim is audacious, the claim is dangerous, and the claim is, at its core, the same claim that Pythagoras made when he established his school in Croton in the 6th century before the Common Era. The same claim that the desert fathers of early Christianity made when they withdrew from the institutional church into the Egyptian wilderness to seek direct experience of God. The same claim that Meister Eckhart made in the 14th century when he declared from the pulpit that the spark of divinity in the human soul was identical with God himself, a claim that earned him a posthumous condemnation for heresy. The claim that the divine is not outside, not above, not accessible only through institutional mediation, but within the human heart, within the human soul, and knowable directly by anyone who undertakes with sufficient seriousness the work of inner transformation. The rose at the centre of the cross does not belong to any church. It does not belong to any order, any lodge, any initiation, any degree. It belongs to the moment which is available to every human being who has ever lived. When the crossing of the temporal and the eternal occurs inside the living heart, when the work of transformation reaches its culmination, when the base metal of the uninitiated self finally yields to the fire that has been burning in it all along, and what emerges is not the same substance but a different substance, not heavier and duller but lighter and brighter, capable of transmitting the light it has received. This is what the seven-sided vault contained. This is what the Book M recorded. This is what Christian Rosenkreuz brought back from Fez and Damascus and the temples of Egypt. And this is what the anonymous authors of the Fama Fraternitatis were calling toward when they wrote their extraordinary call to the learned of Europe in the midst of a continent tearing itself apart in the name of competing institutional claims to the same God. They were calling for a reformation deeper than Luther's, deeper than any political or theological reformation, because it did not target institutions from the outside. It targeted the human soul from the inside. It said that the problem was not this pope, or that king, or this church, or that parliament. The problem was the uninitiated self, attached to comfort and convention, and the small certainties of the surface world, afraid of the fire that genuine transformation requires. The Rosicrucian tradition, across all its forms and centuries and institutional expressions, has been the carrier of a single invitation: come in out of the surface of things, go deeper, submit to the fire, discover what you actually are beneath everything you have been told you are and beneath everything you have told yourself. And in this sense, the tradition connects all religions because it underlies all religions, not in the surface sense that all religions worship the same God. A claim that anyone with eyes can see is contradicted by the vastly different conceptions of divinity that different traditions has developed, but in the deeper sense that every genuine spiritual tradition has produced at its innermost layer a mystical current that makes the same claim, that the divine is not outside but within, that transformation not theology is the purpose of spiritual life, that gnosis not belief is the fruit of the path, and that the only credential that matters at the threshold of the innermost sanctuary is the sincerity of the seeking. With this is the perennial philosophy, not as a comfortable universal relativism that says all paths are equally good and it doesn't really matter what you do, but as a demanding recognition that the fire burns the same in every furnace, regardless of what metal has been placed inside. What the Rosicrucian tradition added to this perennial current was its particular genius for synthesis. It gathered from Egypt and Greece, from Kabbalah and Hermeticism, from Christian mysticism and Islamic Sufism, from Paracelsian medicine and Pythagorean mathematics, a set of tools, symbols, correspondences, initiatory structures, alchemical processes that could be used in any era and any cultural context to describe and facilitate the same fundamental journey. The Rose Cross is not the property of any one age. It has appeared under different names in every age, because every age produces people who are genuinely tired of the surface and genuinely willing to go deeper. The tomb is not a grave. It is a womb. The 7 sides are 7 gateways. The artificial sun that illuminates the vault is not a lamp. It is the light that has been waiting inside you since before the first word was written in the first mystery school of ancient Egypt, since before the first rose opened in the spring of the first year there was a world to open in. Well, 400 years have passed since those strange anonymous posters appeared on the walls of Paris, and the hearts of European scholars were set ablaze with the possibility of contact, the possibility of knowledge, the possibility of transformation. The Brotherhood has not disappeared. The tradition has not ended. It has merely continued its ancient practice of going underground when the surface world is too dangerous or too shallow to sustain it, and re-emerging when the conditions are right, when the seekers are sincere, when the time is ready. Every generation produces such people. Every generation produces those who are not satisfied with the inherited answers, who sense at the edges of the official story a larger story that nobody in authority has any interest in telling, who feel in the symbols of their tradition something that the institutional custodians of that tradition have long since stopped seeing. These are the people the Rosicrucians have always addressed. Not the powerful, not the credentialed, not the comfortably settled, the restless, the genuinely wondering, the ones who still, despite everything, cannot stop asking what is really going on beneath the surface of this world, and who are willing, genuinely willing, to pay whatever price the answer demands. Find it. The thoughts attached to the real desire of the seeker will lead us to him and him to us.